We've also talked a little bit about exempt market dealers or other investment dealers that are the ones actually facilitating the sales of these investments. And they have other restrictions as well. They have to make sure, first and foremost, that their investors meet one of the qualifications for a prospectus exemption. But on top of that, they also have to inform themselves about their clients to make sure that when those clients are investing, it's suitable. It means, is this a good idea for that investor based on what their time horizon is, their investment objectives, their own personal financial circumstances to acquire that investment? So you sort of have these twin barriers at any given time. You have to meet certain tests, typically financial, and you also have to make sure that it's right for you based on what you're trying to accomplish. Together, those can make it somewhat difficult for investors to access the marketplace unless they're having somebody else shepherd them through the process, typically a dealer or an issuer that's very sophisticated. And I think that's important because for a conversation around investor autonomy, you have to understand the barrier that you're looking to overcome. Access to capital is really what this is all about, right? Like companies being able to issue securities to capitalize the business and then operate. It becomes a conversation about investor protection. We've had a system for a long time now that has based a lot of that around financial tests. Okay, you can go and invest in these type of businesses, or what's your net worth? You can invest in these type of businesses.
Quantitative.
Yeah, purely quantitative. The problem with that, and I think we're getting better as a society, is realizing that like wealth distribution is not always equitable. That's fundamentally what's happening. But when you say that the ability to access a market is based on wealth, you're also cutting certain demographics out of being able to raise money. You know, I've made the joke before, like if you didn't grow up with rich friends, how do you start a business? Not even just because you can't find someone who's willing to write you a check, but you can't find someone who's legally allowed to write you a check. And that's a change that has to happen. We're already seeing that in a few certain instances. The Alberta Securities Commission, Saskatchewan, and Ontario have each announced a self-certified investor exemption. And I think that's a really important one. It's one of the first times where they've focused entirely on proficiency, which is what you're talking about, education and proficiency, those that are comfortable ascertaining risk before they participate, and based on that are allowed to participate in the market. Not just, you know, how much money is in your wallet right now, Tommy, okay, you can actually buy. It's, are you qualified to make these decisions? And I think that's going to be really big for breaking down barriers and getting more people the ability to become entrepreneurs, and it all goes back to capital formation. Everybody who is qualified and wants to start a business needs to be able to raise the money to do that. We can't have systemic reasons why it's impossible, and that needs to change.
The enforcement actions have to be stepped up so that those individuals who go to raise capital under the guise of starting a business, but have some type of other plans for the capital, are punished, because if the bad actors aren't discouraged from being in our capital markets, they'll just pop up again and again. And we've seen that at different points in time, right? I think, the ASC and those that have followed along have done a really good job in looking for solutions. They may not have it right all the time, but they're trying things, I think one of the things that, that I've learned over the years is that there isn't a really good awareness of the rules. So this self-certified investor exemption may exist, but if the entrepreneurial community doesn't know it exists, it's not serving a purpose. And I think that sometimes we get away from figuring out what rules are actually really understood in the marketplace. And there's such a focus on trying to create this perfect rule book, these perfect regulations, when really maybe what should be done is some outreach to the community to let them know that these exemptions exist in the first place. Or rather than creating new rules, spend more time enforcing and educating on the ones that do exist. It's well known that there is a pending merger. I guess at the time of airing, there will be a merger between IIROC and the Mutual Fund Dealers Association of Canada. Now, those are the two largest groups representing advisors in Canada. But then there's already discussions about the next step perhaps being absorbing exempt market dealers and portfolio managers and investment fund managers under that same umbrella. Fundamentally, what this is doing is taking a lot of the regulatory power away from the provincial securities commissions and handing it over to this one self-regulatory organization. Now, that's not a foregone conclusion, it's in discussions, but I'm really interested in what your group's thoughts are on that. Before we get into that, I want to share mine. There is a real hesitancy in my mind that the keys to any one kingdom should be given to one group. And when it comes to capital formation, which is the lifeblood of the entrepreneurial community, turning that over to a very large group is alarming to me. Each province has its own particular nuances and industries for which capital formation is very important. As an Albertan, a lot of junior oil and gas companies started with prospectus exemptions. If those go away because of this SRO, that's going to be really challenging. You have exempt market dealers like Whitehaven that raise money for entrepreneurs. If they get brought into a system where the costs of running an organization are so high that they can't afford to raise money for the little guy, who does? Is the little guy still allowed to raise money for himself or herself? It may well be more efficient for those large groups to be regulated by one group instead of two. I understand there's some efficiencies in back office staff and procedures, but should securities commissions be considering giving regulation of EMDs to an SRO?
I think it comes down to diversity. You talk about IIROC, which represent all of our banks. You talk about the Mutual Fund Dealers Association of Canada. They are absolutely polarizing to some degree to the exempt market or private market industry. So absolutely, there's some concern. And if you've just given the keys to the castle to one entity, and that one entity is what's calling the shots, how is that diversifying opportunity? Because if you don't have an understanding of the space, and this is again where I sort of empathize with our regulators, if you don't understand the private markets, how can you regulate it? If you don't understand the industry as a whole, because you are with IIROC underneath their current SRO, how can you regulate it? The regulator's mandate is to foster a fair and efficient capital market whilst maintaining investor protection.
And I think if you look at IIROC and the MFDA's track record of maintaining small firms, it's pretty deplorable. Small firms die on the vine on the SROs as it stands right now. So when you combine them into a super SRO, the idea that they're somehow going to be friendlier to the little guy is it's really hard to think that that's going to be the case. And fundamentally, exempt market dealers are small businesses. They're small dealerships, right? So the idea that they would thrive under an umbrella of an SRO is hard for me to grasp. At the same time, the trickle down effect of that is EMDs raise money for small businesses, much more so than the large IIROC firms and the large mutual fund dealers. So who's going to raise money for them?
I'm personally at this stage very nervous that there's going to be a market that's going to be put a bit to the side. And I guess we'll see over time.
So we have an inherently fractured system already where each of the 13 jurisdictions in this very big country, so it kind of makes sense sometimes, big country with 13 jurisdictions, each with their own securities regulator. And sometimes they don't agree. Our rules are somewhat harmonized, but not all the way harmonized. And that can be difficult. And in the private markets, I think we see that very clearly. If you had a mutual fund trust that was an investment fund, but a non-redeemable investment fund. And I don't want to get into the details of what that is, but they're very common in the private markets. That would be an investment you buy into a pooled vehicle and you can redeem out, but not all the time. Now that company could raise money in BC with very few limitations using an offering memorandum for retail investors. They can go do a lot. In Alberta, they can't raise it from every single type of investor, and then they go to Ontario and they're not allowed to use the offering memorandum at all. That is a fractured system, and it's difficult for anybody to then go and raise capital in the private markets if they have to learn the nuanced rules of 13 different jurisdictions. We have constitutional rules as to why it's set up in this way. The idea with an SRO merger is that you have something that feels a little bit more like a national regulator around the intermediaries, the dealers that are participating in that environment. That could create efficiencies because people need to learn one set of rules and operate for one set of rules and then go across the entire nation. The counterpoint to it, though, is if you're there alongside all of the other market participants, do you get pushed down to the bottom if you are the private markets? And we talk about risk-adjusted returns for investors being something that they seek in the private markets, but for investment dealers, they're also seeking risk-adjusted returns. They go into a business enterprise that they can make the most money at and take the least amount of risk. And a lot of the time, that's not going to be entrepreneurs.
It's efficient, to have one set of rules. But what if it's the wrong set of rules? I mean, to go back to your example, if there was only one rule maker and they picked Ontario's rule in that particular scenario, which, call me a conspiracy theorist, but I think Ontario weighs a little heavier on regulation than the other provinces by virtue of their population and perhaps just historic where these things derive from, then that entrepreneur can't raise capital at all under that exemption. And it's the challenge is believing that that SRO is going to have real consideration for the needs and the wants of the smaller group when really 90% of or 99% of what they're there to serve is the larger institutions. And that goes down to, again, this dual mandate that regulators have to deal with, which is very challenging, of efficient capital formation and investor protection. There might not be capital formation at all on this side if this doesn't get the right rule book. And of course there's input and so forth, but we've seen in the past where input's been given and it's fundamentally been ignored because there were other circumstances at play. So that's the challenge here. Like, this could be the very life of the entrepreneurial community in Canada that is at stake here. If investors aren't properly protected, capital formation doesn't happen to begin with because there's no confidence in the marketplace. But capital formation doesn't happen if the rules are so tight that it doesn't allow firms or issuers to survive.
And the optimist in me wants to say that capital formation won't end, even if it doesn't work out. But there's other unintended consequences that I think everybody needs to be prepared for and very cognizant of before they make any decisions. One of the important things to acknowledge here is we're talking about investment advisors. So they've got an embedded duty of care to their clients. In the private capital markets, not every dollar is raised through that network. They're not always investment advisors who actually have a duty to their client. Some issuers can go direct to investors, raise their capital, and they don't have a statutory duty, they don't have suitability, they don't have to protect against conflicts of interest. I mean, it's just you sell and you're good. If the bar gets raised too high or the rules become too cumbersome for the registered investment advisors to service a certain demographic, that money's still going to get raised. Entrepreneurs are still going to need capital. They're going to find other ways to do it. What it's done is it's taken that entire market out of the more regulated marketplace, and it's going to happen either behind the scenes, either directly, hopefully not illegally, but quite frankly, it probably will.
This really just goes back to what Craig was saying earlier with regards to enforcement or potential lack thereof. I know we have seen some regulatory burden outreach by some of the regulators, but we've also heard from some of our provincial regulators, literally in some of their outreach to the community, that there's a gross lack of enforcement. We've heard of directors of enforcement declaring that they've got an incredible amount of tools available to them for enforcement, but yet we do still see, unfortunately, issuers or bad actors out there that from the time of reporting, no enforcement is actually happening until 3 years later. And look at the damage that has happened in the 3 years industry is aware of. We talk about responsibility of care to the investor, whether it be through fiduciary responsibility, suitability responsibility, etc. But yet if a bad actor is still allowed to basically go out and play in the same sandbox, there's a problem, and there is obviously a huge risk to investors.
There's a principle in securities regulation they call the gatekeeper principle, and the gatekeeper principle sort of says that the registrants are the gatekeepers of the capital markets. So those are the dealers, the advisors, the fund managers. They're sort of responsible for making sure that everybody that gets to come and play in this environment is held to a certain standard. One of the things that I've always disliked about overregulation is that it typically focuses on them. It overregulates their activities, and that causes people to avoid becoming one of those people. I don't want to be overregulated, so I'll find a way not to become a gatekeeper and not be held to that standard. What I'd like to see is almost making it easier for those market participants, dealers, portfolio managers, fund managers, etc., access larger amounts of the market. If clients are funneled towards people that have an active duty of care to them, the rules aren't quite as important. Every incremental rule doesn't matter so much if a duty of care is there as the big trapeze net to catch that client. A breach of your duty of care is a problem. And the consequences of investment can be very high, right? So My biggest fear always when I talk about this stuff is that we create situations that will push people away from advised relationships towards going it alone, towards, I mean, even the discount brokerage comment that you had. And I hope that if they do an SRO merger, that that's something they keep in mind. They don't want to chase people away from the exempt market.